What if I told you that three men in history never experienced death? While every human faces mortality, the Bible reveals an astonishing mystery: Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek, three figures who bypassed the grave in extraordinary ways. How did they achieve this? What set them apart from the rest of humanity? Their lives were marked by deep faith, divine favor, and a connection with God so profound that death could not touch them. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths behind their miraculous stories. What we're about to reveal might change the way you see life and eternity forever. The mystery of three men who never tasted death. Throughout history, death has been an unavoidable reality for all people. As Romans 5:12 explains, death entered the world through sin and has affected every human since. But what if there were exceptions? The Bible presents a fascinating mystery: three extraordinary men who never experienced death: Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek. Their stories defy the natural order, leaving us to wonder, what made them so unique? How did they escape the fate that awaits all humanity? These three men were not just figures of biblical history. They were individuals who lived with such unwavering faith and devotion to God that He intervened in their earthly journeys in miraculous ways. Their lives were marked by righteousness, obedience, and a deep relationship with the Creator. Rather than experiencing death, each of them was taken in a divine manner that still sparks wonder today. The first of these remarkable men is Enoch, a man who walked with God so closely that he was taken directly into His presence. Genesis 5:24. While the rest of his generation lived long lives only to eventually die, Enoch's faith and righteousness set him apart. Hebrews 11:5 confirms this, stating that, "By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death." His life serves as a testament to the power of intimacy with God and the rewards of unwavering faith. Next, we have Elijah, the bold prophet who confronted kings, performed miracles, and called Israel back to God. Elijah's ministry was filled with divine encounters, from calling down fire from heaven to raising the dead. Yet his departure was even more miraculous. He was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, 2 Kings 2:11. Unlike Enoch, whose disappearance was quiet and mysterious, Elijah's departure was a dramatic event witnessed by his successor, Elisha. His life demonstrates God's power and the reward of fearless obedience. The third and most mysterious figure is Melchizedek, described in Hebrews 7:3 as a man with no recorded beginning or end, no genealogy, no birth, and no death. He appears suddenly in Genesis 14, blessing Abraham and receiving his tithe. Melchizedek is both a king and a priest, a role that foreshadows Jesus Christ, the ultimate high priest who reigns forever. Unlike Enoch and Elijah, who were taken, Melchizedek's mystery lies in his eternal priesthood, which sets him apart from all others. These three men challenge our understanding of life and death, revealing that God's power transcends human limitations. Their stories point to a deeper spiritual truth, that a life of faith, obedience, and divine connection holds greater significance than we can comprehend. As we explore their journeys, we are invited to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to walk with God? Perhaps, just like them, we too can experience a life beyond the ordinary. Enoch, the man who walked with God and escaped death. In a world where death is inevitable, Enoch's story stands as a divine exception. As we explored earlier, three men in history never tasted death: Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek. But among them, Enoch was the first to experience this mystery. Unlike others who lived and died, Enoch's deep faith and unwavering walk with God led to an extraordinary fate. He was taken directly into God's presence. His life serves as a powerful testament to what it means to walk in true devotion and righteousness. Enoch lived during a time of moral decay when sin and corruption were widespread. Yet instead of conforming to the world around him, he chose a different path, a path of intimacy with God. Genesis 5:24 states, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. This phrase isn't just poetic, It reveals an intimate, ongoing relationship between Enoch and his Creator. His life wasn't defined by religious rituals alone. It was defined by a deep personal fellowship with God. To fully grasp the significance of Enoch's walk with God, we must understand the meaning behind walking. In biblical terms, walking with God implies constant communication, obedience, and alignment with His will. Enoch didn't just acknowledge God's existence, he lived in a way that pleased Him every single day. His faith was active, not passive. He didn't just believe in God, he sought to know Him personally and follow His ways wholeheartedly. But Enoch's faith wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. Jude 1:14-15 tells us that Enoch prophesied about God's coming judgment, warning the ungodly of their wickedness. This means that his walk with God wasn't just about personal devotion. It was also about calling others to righteousness. He stood as a beacon of light in a dark generation, proving that a life lived in faith can impact the world around us. What makes Enoch's departure from this world so unique is that he never faced death. Hebrews 11:5 confirms this miracle, stating, "By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away." His translation to heaven was not a natural event, it was an act of divine favor. Unlike others who faced the grave, Enoch's life was so pleasing to God that He allowed him to bypass death entirely. Enoch's story challenges us to examine our own faith. Are we merely believing in God, or are we walking with Him daily? His life teaches us that true faith isn't just about knowing God exists. It's about seeking Him, obeying Him, and living in close relationship with Him. Just as Enoch was taken into God's presence, those who walk in faith today can look forward to an eternal future with Him. Elijah, the prophet who was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot. Enoch's extraordinary departure from this world, as we previously explored, was a direct result of his deep walk with God. Yet he was not the only one who escaped death. Elijah, one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history, was also taken into heaven, but in a far more dramatic fashion. Unlike Enoch's quiet disappearance, Elijah's ascension was witnessed by others, showcasing God's undeniable power. Elijah lived in a time of spiritual and moral decline in Israel, when King Ahab and Queen Jezebel led the nation into deep idolatry and corruption. Yet amidst the darkness, Elijah stood as a bold voice for God, calling the people back to faith. His ministry was marked by fearless confrontations, miraculous signs, and unwavering trust in God's provision. One of Elijah's most defining moments was his dramatic showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18. In this powerful event, Elijah challenged the false prophets to a contest. Whichever God answers by fire is the true God. While the prophets of Baal cried out for hours with no response, Elijah prayed a simple yet powerful prayer. God responded with fire from heaven, consuming the altar and proving His supremacy. This moment solidified Elijah's role as a prophet of great faith and divine power. Yet despite his victories, Elijah also experienced deep discouragement. After Queen Jezebel threatened his life, he fled into the wilderness, feeling overwhelmed and alone. But instead of rebuking him, God met Elijah in a whisper. 1 Kings 19:11-12, reminding him that His presence is not always found in dramatic miracles, but in quiet moments of faith. This intimate encounter with God renewed Elijah's strength and purpose. As Elijah's time on earth drew to a close, something incredible happened. He and his successor, Elisha, walked together near the Jordan River when suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. In that instant, Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2:11. Unlike any other prophet before him, he never faced death but was carried directly into God's presence. Elijah's ascension was a public event, witnessed by Elisha, proving that God honors those who remain faithful. His story, like Enoch's, reveals that a life lived in obedience to God holds eternal significance. While Enoch's departure emphasized intimacy with God, Elias emphasized the power of faithfulness, boldness, and perseverance in the face of opposition. Both men remind us that walking with God is not just about escaping death. It's about living a life that pleases Him. Their stories challenge us. Are we standing for truth as Elijah did? Are we walking closely with God like Enoch? If we do, we can trust that God's presence will guide us both in this life and the next. Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king without beginning or end. Elijah's fiery ascension into heaven, much like Enoch's translation, revealed God's power to take the faithful directly into His presence. But while Enoch and Elijah were miraculously taken from this world, there is one more figure in Scripture whose story is even more mysterious: Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem. Unlike Enoch and Elijah, who were visibly taken into heaven, Melchizedek's mystery lies in his very existence. He has no recorded birth, no genealogy, and no death. Melchizedek first appears in Genesis 14, emerging suddenly after Abraham's victory over enemy kings. Without introduction or explanation, he is described as the King of Salem, meaning peace, and the priest of God Most High. This is significant because in biblical times, kings and priests were separate roles, yet Melchizedek held both positions, making him unique among biblical figures. His interaction with Abraham is brief yet profound. Melchizedek blesses Abraham and brings him bread and wine, an act that foreshadows Jesus Christ's later role as our eternal high priest. In response, Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything he owns, symbolizing honor and submission to a higher spiritual authority. This act shows that Melchizedek was not just an ordinary king, he was greater than Abraham, the father of Israel. But what makes Melchizedek truly mysterious is what the Bible does not say about him. In Hebrews 7:3, it states that he had no father, no mother, no genealogy, no beginning, and no end. Unlike other biblical figures who are meticulously traced through family lines, Melchizedek simply appears and then disappears. There is no record of his birth or death, making him an eternal figure in Scripture. Because of this, many scholars believe that Melchizedek was more than just a historical person. Some see him as a symbol of Jesus Christ, whose priesthood is not based on human lineage, but on divine authority. Others believe that Melchizedek may have been a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, appearing briefly to Abraham as a foreshadowing of the eternal priesthood that Jesus would later fulfill. Unlike Elijah, who left this world in a fiery chariot, or Enoch, who was taken in quiet mystery, Melchizedek's uniqueness is in his timelessness. He was not taken from the earth. He simply has no recorded end. His eternal nature points to a greater reality, the everlasting rule of Jesus Christ. Melchizedek's life challenges us to look beyond what is seen and trust in the greater spiritual truths that God has revealed. While Elijah demonstrated the power of faithfulness and Enoch showed us the rewards of intimacy with God, Melchizedek reminds us that God's plan is eternal. His existence was never about earthly power or personal glory. It was about pointing forward to the ultimate high priest, Jesus Christ, who reigns forever. As we reflect on these three remarkable figures, Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek, one question remains: what does it truly mean to walk with God in a way that transcends time? Their stories invite us to seek a faith that is not just temporary but eternal, leading us into a deeper relationship with the one who holds all things in his hands. The timeless lessons of faith from Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek. As we've explored, Melchizedek's mystery lies in his timelessness, a priest-king without a recorded beginning or end, pointing to the eternal nature of Christ. But beyond their miraculous stories, what do Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek teach us today? Their lives were not just extraordinary for their time. They serve as blueprints for how we can walk with God, live in faith, and trust in His divine plan. The first lesson we learn from these men is that walking with God requires faith and obedience. Enoch walked with God for 365 years, Genesis 5:24, demonstrating what it means to live in continuous fellowship with the Creator. He wasn't just religious, he had a deep personal relationship with God, so much so that he never saw death. His story challenges us to ask, Are we just acknowledging God's presence? Or are we walking closely with Him daily? True faith is not about mere belief. It's about seeking God in every aspect of our lives. The second lesson comes from Elijah, who showed us that faith requires boldness and trust in God's power. He stood against a corrupt nation, performed miracles, and called fire from heaven to prove God's supremacy. Yet despite his fearless faith, he also experienced fear and discouragement when Queen Jezebel sought his life. But even in his weakest moment, God met him, not in an earthquake, wind, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:11-12. This teaches us that God is not only found in grand miracles, but also in quiet moments of faith. Elijah's ascension into heaven, 2 Kings 2:11, is a powerful reminder that a life lived in faithfulness to God will never be forgotten. The third lesson is from Melchizedek, who reminds us that true spiritual authority is eternal. Unlike Enoch and Elijah, who were taken to heaven, Melchizedek's role was different. His priesthood never ended. Hebrews 7:3. He appeared suddenly in Genesis, blessed Abraham, and vanished, leaving a legacy that pointed to Jesus Christ as our eternal high priest. His life teaches us that God's plan is not bound by time. Just as Melchizedek's priesthood foreshadowed Christ, our faith in Jesus connects us to something far greater than this present world. Together, these three men demonstrate different aspects of faith. Enoch represents a life of intimacy with God, walking in the daily communion and trust. Elijah symbolizes bold faith and perseverance, showing us that even great prophets had moments of doubt, yet God remained faithful. Melchizedek reflects God's eternal plan, pointing us beyond earthly life to the everlasting priesthood of Christ. Their stories challenge us to live beyond the ordinary, seek God wholeheartedly, and trust that His purpose transcends life and death. Just as they were set apart, we too are called to a faith that is not just momentary, but eternal. The question remains, are we living in a way that reflects the kind of faith that pleases God? Living a life that pleases God, the call to faith and devotion. As we've seen, Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek each demonstrated different aspects of faith, walking closely with God, standing boldly in faith, and pointing to Christ's eternal priesthood. But their stories aren't just historical accounts. They serve as a call for us today. Their lives challenge us to reflect. Are we living in a way that pleases God? Are we walking in faith that leads to something greater than this life? One of the greatest themes from these men's lives is that faith is not passive. It is active, bold, and deeply transformative. Enoch walked with God so intimately that he bypassed death entirely. Elijah's faith made him a bold prophet, but it also meant facing opposition, discouragement, and challenges before he was taken to heaven. Melchizedek, though mysterious, embodied an eternal priesthood that reminds us that God's plan extends far beyond what we can see. Walking in daily fellowship with God. The story of Enoch reminds us that faith is not just about believing, it's about walking with God every day. Hebrews 11:5 tells us that Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death, for before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Hanai, what does it mean to please God? It means living a life of trust, obedience, and constant communion with Him. Like Enoch, we are called to cultivate a relationship with God that goes beyond rituals or occasional prayers. This means prioritizing time in His presence, seeking His guidance, and aligning our lives with His will. The closer we walk with Him, the more our lives reflect His character. Bold faith that perseveres through trials. Elijah's life teaches us that faith is not always easy. It requires boldness, perseverance, and unwavering trust in God. He faced threats, opposition, and moments of despair, yet God never abandoned him. His story reminds us that faith is tested, but God is faithful. When we face struggles, we can either run in fear or stand firm in faith. Like Elijah, we must learn to listen for God's voice, not just in dramatic miracles, but in the quiet moments where He speaks to our hearts. If we remain faithful, we can trust that God will strengthen us and lead us into His promises. Trusting in God's eternal plan. Through Melchizedek's eternal priesthood, we see that God's plan is far greater than our time on earth. His appearance foreshadowed Christ, reminding us that Jesus is our ultimate high priest, and through Him, we have eternal life. The lives of Enoch, Elijah, and Melchizedek point us to something beyond this world. Just as they walked in faith and received divine favor, we too are invited to live lives that reflect God's eternal kingdom. Will we walk in faith? The question we must ask ourselves is, are we living in a way that pleases God? Like Enoch, are we walking with Him daily? Like Elijah, are we standing firm in faith despite trials? Like Melchizedek, do we recognize the eternal purpose of God's plan? Their stories invite us to go beyond the ordinary, to seek God with all our hearts, and to live in faith that leads to an eternal reward.